Good morning, everyone. My name is Aspen Dudzic, and I am the host of Forestry Talks, a podcast that explores all things forestry in Alberta. And I am so thrilled to be joined by Dr. Mike Flannigan, a professor at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, BC. Dr. Mike, how are you doing?
I'm great. Great to be with you, Aspen.
Yeah, super thrilled to have you on my show. Of course, you specialize in wildfire science and fire management and all that kind of stuff. So something super topical for us to explore right now, given, you know, the really crazy season that we've had here over the last few months. But I'm super curious, how did you get into wildfire?
So from an early age, I've been fascinated with fire. My first birthday, I had a cake with one candle, and I stuck my finger in the candle in the flame, and because I was so fascinated by it, and actually I started to cry, but I kept my finger in there because I was still fascinated by it. And you know, I spent my summers in southern Alberta, in the town I lived in. We burned our trash, our garbage. Mm-hmm. So that was one chore I always volunteered because they let me get the matches to start in the 45-gallon drum. So, and then I also love weather. So I started working as a fire weather forecaster, and then moved to Canadian Forest Service and started studying fire weather, and been doing it ever since. It's been over 40 years. So, yeah.
That is incredible. I think this might be one of my favorite origin stories so far that I've heard. Were your parents concerned about this interest in fire at a young age?
I was a bit of a pyro. I still am, although I start all fires legally now. Okay, no illegal fires.
Disclaimer, we're good. Yeah.
But I won't mention the name of the town. But one of my little playthings got away once, and without some help from my parents and uncle, the town might have burned down because it was a hot, dry, windy day, which is not great for fire. So hopefully I learned my lesson.
Yes, well, I imagine so. And so after many years of education in the field, I imagine you know how to play with fire a little bit more safely.
I hope.
Yeah. So what does that look like now? What does playing with fire, I guess, look like for you in a professional aspect now?
Well, it's mostly sitting behind a computer. It's modeling and doing research. I do live vicariously through my students who still go out in the field and do things. But my life is a computer now, as is many people. So this year's just been a crazy year. It's uncharted for Alberta and Canada. It's wild.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about maybe what's creating some of the conditions, or let's first start with what is so unique about the fire season that we're seeing this year.
Well, first, it's a record breaker in our modern day records, which go back to 1959 for Alberta. We've burned 1.7 million hectares. That may not mean much to most people, but it's about 20 times the size of Calgary or Edmonton. So it's a big chunk of real estate. And it started early, and with record-breaking heat, and temperature is very important to fire. And we can maybe talk about that later, why temperature, hot, dry, windy, people understand, but how about what's going on with temperature? So we started early, and unlike other years where you have a flare up, and you think back in Alberta, every 3 to 5 years we seem to have fire. 2011, Slave Lake. 2015 was very active, but not in May. 2016, Fort McMurray, of course. 2019, Chuckade Creek. Now 2023. And May is the busiest month for fire in Alberta. And it's the only jurisdiction in Canada where that's the case. So Alberta is a bit different in that regard. So we started with record-breaking heat, and we had the fires. And unlike many other years, as spring progresses, things green up. The grass turns green, the aspen comes out and flushes, and then the fire season quiets down. Not so much this year. It kept on burning. It may have not made the news because Nova Scotia caught on fire, then Quebec caught on fire. Meanwhile, Northern Alberta was still burning. It's still burning as I speak, which is it's July, which is, some years are busy and some years are quiet. So it's just started with a bang, and it's keep on burning and burning and burning. And it looks like it's going to burn. Some of these fires are huge. They'll burn right through summer, right through fall. And some of them will burn right through winter underground. They'll smolder. And, this is not unheard of. The Fort McMurray fire started May 1st, 2016, declared out summer of 2017. So I expect some of these will burn through the winter.
Yeah, so that's, something that maybe not a lot of people are aware about. How are these fires burning during the winter? What does that look like? And how is the snow not putting them out?
So we have what's called peatlands, and people may be familiar with the term bog. And it's just organic material that's 40 centimeters or more in depth. Sphagnum mosses, you get your landscaping store or your nursery. So the fire burns underground in this peat moss, and it can burn and smolder. It's not flaming combustion, it's smoldering. Meanwhile, on the forest floor, there's snow, but underneath, there's this smoldering fire. Eventually, spring comes, snow melts, and it gets warm, dry, and windy, and the smoldering fire goes back to the surface and then starts spreading. Some people call them zombie fires. Well, yeah, catchy. Definitely
an interesting name. I'm surprised that the fire would not suffocate under all that snow, because of course we know that fire needs oxygen to burn. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. There's enough air spaces in the peat. I mean, it doesn't need much oxygen. There's enough for it to smolder. You're right. It needs oxygen. Yeah. But there is sufficient amount because it's not like a solid rock. There's little air spaces in there that provide oxygen.
Okay, interesting. So we're, maybe forecasting that we might see some of the fires that are burning in Alberta right now burn all the way through the winter. Something that I believe that I read, I probably won't have the numbers correct right now, but there was something about the fires in Alberta this year and how much they spread over the period of even just a night from one day to the next. We were seeing fires travel significant distances. What's contributing to that?
Well, hot, dry, windy. Maybe I'll back up a bit. To have a wildfire, there's a simple recipe. You need 3 ingredients. First, you need the vegetation. We call it fuel. What type, how much, how dry, all important aspects. Second, you need ignition, people and lightning. And third, you need warm or hot, dry, windy conditions. You get all 3, you get a wildfire. So we did have extreme fire weather. We had hot, dry, windy weather in spades this year. Also, we had something called pyro-CBs or pyrocumulonimbus, fire-generated thunderstorms. And these are known to spread high intensities, spread rapidly. This year in Canada, we've had over 100 of these fire-generated thunderstorms. The previous global record was 102 for the globe for a fire year. So Canada alone has already exceeded that for 2023. So this is an exceptional year, the uncharted territory we're in. And those pyro-CBs can spread very rapidly. And there's some on the Fort McMurray fire, McMillan fire, Chisholm. There's a lot of history of having these pyro-CBs, but they're becoming much more frequent. And with that, we see higher intensities and rapid spread.
And what's creating these conditions for these fire thunderstorms, essentially?
So it's a couple things at play. First is the intensity. So as things get hotter and drier, more fuel's available to burn, which leads to higher intensity fires. And so that develops a good column. So, for every kilogram of fuel or vegetation you burn, you get more energy. So, and as we get this hot, dry weather, more fuel is available to burn, more vegetation. And so you get more energy. So you get an energetic plume, updraft, and it just keeps on rising. And it's like your grade 3 water cycle. As air rises, eventually starts to cool and condense, form clouds, and it keeps rising. Precipitation, thunder, lightning. And a lot of people may not be aware, but during the combustion process, not only does it release heat, it also releases moisture that's trapped in the wood and the fuel. And so you got moisture and that lift, and you get a thunderstorm.
Mm-hmm.
And the Fort McMurray thunderstorm, for example, the Fort McMurray fire had a pyro-CB, and it had lightning, and it started new fires downwind from the original Fort McMurray fire.
Wow.
So self-propagating.
Yeah, all essentially resulting from the original fire. And you mentioned, the hot and dry conditions, all of these dry fuels contributing to some of the crazy and intense fires that we've seen. I want to talk about how Alberta's fire season is typically in May, and that's a time of the year where we might see a lot more dry fuels, things like grasses that are dry and dead. I mean, there's, the surface area to volume ratio is pretty notable, so that's where we might see lots of fires. But why is it that we're seeing these happen mostly in Alberta as compared to, other jurisdictions in Canada? You mentioned maybe later in the season.
So there's something called the spring window, and this occurs pretty well all across Canada. So after the snow leaves, it exposes all that dead organic material from the previous autumn, grasses, needles, leaves. And, so there's an opportunity for a fire to start, as long as it's not raining or snowing. So that window between snow melt and vegetation green up is 3 to 4 weeks. It occurs all across Canada. And in Canada, half the fires are started by people and half by lightning. It's pretty close to being true for Alberta as well. Human-caused fires dominate in the spring, lightning in the summer. So we see this all across Canada. Why is it more pronounced in Alberta? Because there's more industrial activity, more recreational activity. Quads or four-wheelers are notorious for starting fires. And you say, well, there's a couple ways. How do they do this? Well, first, you park on dry grass. And whether it's a car or a quad, you have a hot muffler, tall grass, starts a fire.
Right.
The other way is, as you go along the trail, often you get this peaty material gets on the muffler. It starts to warm up, even starts to smolder. You go over a bump, falls off, hits dry grass, starts a fire. So that's why we have things like fire bans and forest closures to reduce the likelihood of these fire starts. But probably the main reason is the weather patterns we see in Alberta are kind of unique for May compared to other jurisdictions. What happens is an Arctic high comes down to our east over Manitoba, say, and so you get very dry Arctic air, and you've got a low pressure over BC or the Pacific Ocean. You get a very strong southeast gradient, and the Slave Lake fire was a classic example of that. And it's extremely dry, persistent, and it's strong during the day and night, and the fuels get really dry. And if there's any ignition, whether it's a campfire, agricultural burning, or even burning your garbage, like I mentioned, some of the fires, the winds are so strong, it tips over the burning barrel and starts a fire. So that's why we get these strong southeast gradients, these strong southeast winds. That's one of the conditions for a fire. As I said, you need fuel, the vegetation. It's in spring window, it's dry, ignition. Unfortunately, a lot of them in May in Alberta are human caused, and then you get that dry, windy conditions, and away we go.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, kind of the combination of these factors really all at one time is part of what's contributing to the early fire season in Alberta.
Yes, and unfortunately, we see this every 3 to 5 years. It just, if you look past at our record, it seems like every 10 years we'd have a bad fire season. Now it seems like every 3 to 5 years we have a very active May.
And what might be contributing to this increase in frequency?
We're seeing warmer, drier conditions, and our climate is warming. And one of the things our research has shown is the warmer we get, the more fire we see. And you say, whoa, why is temperature so important here? Mm-hmm. And, I'm not talking about individual fire like the Fort McMurray fire, the Slave Lake fire, where wind is a critical aspect. Here I'm talking about fire over a longer period of time, like decades, over a larger area, like Alberta. 3 reasons. Fire people love 3s. All right. First is the warmer we get, the longer our fire seasons are. And in Alberta, this is true. Our fire season officially used to start April 1st. Now it's March 1st. So more opportunity for fire to start and burn with our longer fire seasons. Second, the warmer we get, the more lightning we see.
Right.
And the more lightning we see, the more fires we see. And the third reason is probably the most important, but probably the most convoluted, okay? As the atmosphere warms, the ability to suck moisture out of that vegetation, that fuel, and here I'm talking about dead fuels on the forest floor, cured grass, needles, leaves, that respond very quickly to the environment. These fuels dry out exponentially as temperature increases. So unless we see more rain, and our models of what the future may look like suggest we're not going to see enough rain to compensate for this drying effect, is that we're going to have drier fuels, okay? And this is a critical piece for fire, because the drier the fuel, it means it's easier for a fire to start, easier for a fire to spread, and it means more fuel, vegetation's available to burn, which leads to those higher intensity fires that are possible to extinguish. A warmer world means more fire, and that's what we're seeing in BC, that's what we're seeing in Alberta, and that's what we're seeing in Canada. And in particular this year is extreme year. And that's another thing about fire is it's all about the extremes. If fire starts on an average summer day, Alberta wildfire can put it out easy. If fire starts on a day when the fuels are dry and it's hot, dry, and windy, now that's another problem.
Right.
In Canada, 3% of the fires burn, 97% of the area burned. And much of this happens on a relatively small number of critical days. We call them spread days, hot, dry, windy. All right? That's when the fire actively spreads. And we're seeing more of these hot, dry, windy days. Thus, we're seeing more fire. The new reality is, I don't like the term normal. It's not normal because we're on a downward spiral. Dante's circles of hell. Are we in the third cycle or fourth cycle? All I know is there's more. It can get worse. Yeah. So, we're going to see more fire. Unfortunately, more smoke. That's the new reality. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, I mean, that feels pretty daunting. But we know that there are programs like Fire Smart that's taking some measures to try and help mitigate this. We can talk a little bit later about the role of forest management and sustainable forestry, but maybe we'll start with Fire Smart. What does that look like? What's the role there in mitigating risks? And let's just chat a little bit about Fire Smart.
Sure. So for those not familiar with it, just put Fire Smart or Fire Smart Canada in your browser, and there's a website that will walk you through things. There's 7 principles to Fire Smart to help homeowners and community reduce the risk of wildfire. We can never eliminate the risk. Well, I guess if we built a community of pavement and concrete, I guess you could, but for most places, we reduce the risk. Yeah. And things like education, vegetation management, and some of it's common sense. And you just don't have any flammable material against your house, because what many people don't realize, a fire enters a community through a rain of burning embers, not through the fire front. And this burning embers land on things, and it's just, fire's opportunistic, it's probing, it's trying to spread, okay? And so this burning embers, if it falls on something flammable beside your house, a cedar hedge, a mulch, it catches fire, and then your house catches fire, and then your neighbor's house catches fire, and so on, from structure to structure. So you have to prevent that, roofing material, needles in your eaves troughs. There's so many ways that fire can start through these rain of burning embers. So building material, is really important. And this is part of the problem with fire is governance. Some things are controlled by the municipality, some by the province, and some by the feds. And getting everyone on the same page for building codes, community planning, it's challenging, but we have to do it, because these are some of the things we can do. Education is important. Human-caused fires in Canada have been going down because of education and fire bans. I mean, there are things we can do in addition to Fire Smart. Things like sprinklers are very effective. But you have to realize that when a fire enters a community, and this happened in Slave Lake, it happened in Fort McMurray, the first thing that goes is municipal power, followed by municipal water. pressure. So if you use sprinklers, which I highly recommend, you have to have independent power, independent water supply, which makes it more challenging, but it is doable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, great point to encourage some folks to look into what those fire spreading practices might be and how they can incorporate it. I certainly take your point about the complexities of having all of these different jurisdictions and governing bodies on the same page. But, it is really important that, we notice the trends of wildfire and we make those efforts to be fire smart. I find it really interesting. You almost speak about fire as though it's a living organism, in a sense. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I've been studying fire all my life.
Yeah.
And, I keep on learning new things. It's really quite amazing. But it is kind of, well, you've heard things like the beast and, the Fort McMurray fire. And yeah, it's not a person. But, just some of its nature, it's spreading, it's looking for opportunities, and sometimes it's so simple. And there was a home I saw unfortunately burned down just outside Slave Lake, and they'd done everything right except for they had a mulch strip along their driveway, and the fire found it and just like a wick went to the house and burned the house down. Other places they've had a wood fence and the fire burned along the fence and unfortunately burned the house down. So this probing, opportunistic nature of fire, it's kind of like a human characteristic.
Yeah, absolutely. You're mentioning some examples from Slave Lake, and I recognize we probably should have established this earlier. While you do work in BC now, you've done a lot of work in Alberta previously, so you are quite familiar with the fire ecosystem and the world of fire in Alberta, right?
Yeah, I worked with the Canadian Forest Service for a number of years in Edmonton at the Northern Forestry Centre. I also worked for about 10 years at the University of Alberta. So yes, I've been watching fires in Alberta for some time.
Yeah, pretty good understanding of the role of that in our province for sure. Let's talk about the role of forestry and forest management and the relationship to wildfire. And what do you kind of see there?
It's really a complicated situation. And yeah, to be honest, this is starting to move outside my area of research.
Fair enough.
All right. So
nope, that's totally fair, and I respect that. Maybe something that we could talk about is the nature of the boreal forest and how we know that it is disturbance driven. We know that we have certain cones that rely on fire to open up, and so what kind of makes the boreal unique in that sense as compared to other forests?
So, our trees in the boreal, they survive and even thrive in this regime of semi-regular, stand replacing, stand renewing, high intensity fire. And, you mentioned cones. They're serotinous cones. They're sealed with a waxy resin, and the heat from the fire actually opens them up. This includes lodgepole pine, jack pine, and black spruce is semi-serotinous. And so you have a stand of jack pine, a fire goes through, you get a new stand of jack pine. It's the cycle of life. It's Mother Nature doing her thing. And, our fire management practices historically have been, let's put out fire because it's bad. And sometimes fire for our society is bad, Slave Lake, Fort McMurray, etc. That's not great. But fire is natural, all right? And, our forests, that's the normal situation is fire goes through, you get a new stand, it burns, and then you get another new stand. And aspen suckers. So, Fort McMurray surrounded by aspen, fires go through, and it kills the parent tree. But underneath, you got the root system, and you get a whole bunch of new suckers coming up afterwards. Now, if we get too much fire, this is a concern as we see more and more fire on our landscape. If you get too much fire, then the conifers do not reach sexual maturity for viable seeds. And so, if fire goes through, there's no seed for the next crop. Aspen, if you keep on getting high intensity fires, it will knock it down. But what replaces our forest? shrublands or grass. And once again, it's fuel. Grass can burn every year quite happily. So we'll always have fire because there'll always be stuff to burn. There'll always be ignition agents like lightning, even if we prevent every human-caused fires. And that is something we can do because, human-caused fires are going down, and let's keep that trend going.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that you mentioned, the benefits of fire when it comes to renewing or resetting the forest, but also some of the risks. And so a concept that I was exposed to recently that I'm hoping you might be able to explore with me a little bit is healthy versus unhealthy fires, and how we might be in a position where we have quite a lot of mature forests, where we've got lots of those fuels, and we're maybe seeing instances where these fires are burning so intensely that they're considered unhealthy for the forest. And so can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I might want to phrase it wanted versus unwanted fires. So if a fire starts 2 kilometers from Fort McMurray, it's unwanted fire. It takes you a half second to say, we don't want this fire, let's put it out. And the strategy with fire management is initial attack. You hit hard, you hit it fast while it's small, and it's easy to put out. 50 kilometers north of Fort McMurray or 100 kilometers north, you look at the fire weather forecast for the next week or two, you look where the fire will spread, fire growth modeling, we call it. And, you may say, hey, there's mountain pine beetle spreading up here. Fire is a great agent knocking down mountain pine beetle. So it may be what we call a wanted fire versus an unwanted fire. So fire management is changing to work with Mother Nature when and where possible. Obviously, fires starting 2 kilometers from Whitecourt or Grand Prairie, these are unwanted fires. The fires starting in more remote areas where they're not threatening communities or critical infrastructure, we should monitor these fires and let Mother Nature play a role when possible.
Yeah,
it's challenging though, and so in northern Saskatchewan, where there's not much human footprint on the landscape, this is easy to do. Same with northern Manitoba, northern Ontario, northern Quebec, Northwest Territories, but there's a lot of development in Alberta. And that's what makes it much more challenging. So maybe we should be doing prescribed burning. Yes, we should be doing more prescribed burning, but it's challenging because it's kind of like a Goldilocks problem in that if it's too wet, it won't burn. If it's too dry, it will burn too well, or you don't have any resources, helicopters or crews, because they're out fighting wildfires. So it's got to be not too wet, not too dry, just right. And those windows are really quite narrow. And of course, prescribed fires generate smoke, and people really do not like smoke, and for good reason.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly from the smoke and the ash and stuff from all those wildfires, there are impacts further down the line to our water systems and other things like that. So yeah, it's definitely a tricky space. And when it comes to things like prescribed burns, that's something that I've heard, lots about before as well. It's the conditions have to be just absolutely right to do it in the safest and most responsible way possible.
But we should be doing more of it. But yeah, it's challenging.
All right, well, Mike, this has been a lot of fun and super informative, so I really appreciate you making the time to join me on our podcast, Forestry Talks. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think we've covered the bases, and great chatting with you, Aspen.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mike. You take care.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Forestry Talks, a podcast that explores all things forestry in Alberta. My name is Aspen, and if you're curious to learn more about forestry in Alberta, check out our website, loveabforests.ca, and follow us on social media at loveabforests.
This series is proudly produced by the team at Road 55. Road 55 creates content that connects. For more information, check our website, www.road55.ca.